Well, good morning. This is Roger Rose with the Eagle Certification Group, and this is going to be a smaller presentation than what we did a couple weeks ago. This is for just the food manufacturing group, modules 2 and modules 11. So it's not going to be nearly as long as it was when we reviewed all the SQF changes. So basically, I want to apologize first. I'm fighting a cold. Just got back from the SQF conference, so if I sound different than normal, that's why. So basically what we want to do is we want an overview of changes to the SQF version 8 food safety code for food processing, for food manufacturing. We're going to look a little bit at the food fraud and by no means cover everything that you need to look at or need to have prepared for a food fraud. We're going to look at regulatory compliance, and you'll probably get this in another session, but we just think it's important to hear it several times. And we're also going to look at corrective actions, which will probably also get several times. But again, that is being stressed by SQF, and we need to make sure that these things are being taken care of and being handled, and that actual corrective actions and objective evidence is prepared properly, because we may have to reject a lot of them in the upcoming year. So basically, the code changed the levels. And what I mean by change the levels, they went from no more level 1, 2, or 3. You know, some companies still refer to SQF 1000 or 2000 in their documents, and now that's way past due and really needs to be changed. But the main change here is that the quality module is its own module. It will add cost to the audit, and actual time will be added for the audit, in addition to a half-day audit report. It also has its own report, so if you're currently level 3 and you want to continue the quality code, you will have 2 repository track reports, which adds time to the auditor, thus adding cost. The reason why SQF split it out this way was there was concerns at SQF and the stakeholders that the quality plans were not looked at sufficiently, and if they were separated out, the auditor could focus on the quality plan and any of the quality control points and critical points. So this is basically a list of the implementation dates for Edition 8. Edition 8 will be in full implementation on January 2nd. And again, it's very basic. If you're going to have an audit in 2018, it'll be to Edition 8. It will be fully implemented. If the initial certification audit commences with a desk audit prior to January 2nd, the certification audit is scheduled for or after January 2nd, then the desk audit will be conducted to Edition 7.2 and the site audit to Edition 8. What that means is going to be several additional procedures that will be involved with Edition 8 that will have to be looked at during the site audit. And then also surveillance audits conducted on or after January 2nd will again be audited against SQF Code Edition 8. This is basically just summarizing again the food safety fundamentals, the food safety code, and the quality code. Whether they're level 1, level 2, and 3, they're now being referred to as food safety fundamentals, food safety code, and the quality code. Now, each food safety code for each industry, such as food manufacturing, food packaging, storage and distribution, all have their own Part A, their own Module 2, and then the specific module for that industry. 11 would be for food manufacturing, 12 would be for storage and distribution, and then 13 would be for packaging. Don't forget that all the food sector codes include a glossary. That is very important. So many times people forget about the glossary, but the glossary helps in many critical definitions of things that auditors have to audit against. A good example of that is HACCP training. HACCP training is specifically spelled out in the glossary. It's a specific requirement. So look back there, make sure that you're meeting that requirement for your HACCP training of your key individuals, of your SQF practitioner. It also has a good definition for hazardous chemicals, and basically when you look at it, all the chemicals you might have in your plant is going to be hazardous. It also has definitions for high-risk foods, recouping product, and rework. So just real quickly, SQF Food Safety Fundamentals, formerly known as Level 1, applies to manufacturing of food, food packaging, primary production, distribution, includes Modules 7, 11, 12, and 13. Remove the requirement to have SQF practitioner attend HACCP training. Change system element, HACCP not required, and not GFSI benchmarked. Very, very important. And we try to share this with all of our clients who are formerly Level 1 or Food Safety Fundamentals, that this is not a GFSI recognized scheme. The SQF Food Safety Manufacturing Code, separate Part A, as we mentioned earlier, and several system elements. And it covers all those different food sector codes. I'm not going to read them all to you. Applicable modules are 3, 4, 9, 10, and 11. And it's going to be submitted for GFSI version 7 for benchmarking. This is the Food Safety Code for primary production. We're not going to go over it. They have a separate one, as we mentioned. There's a separate one for storage and distribution. There's a separate one for packaging manufacturing. And there's a separate one for code for retail, which is a new standard that was tested and prototyped last year, which we were a part of and did a prototype audit, and is now being added to the list of food sector codes that are available for SQF certification. So the Part A update, they added requirements for our operational cleaning shifts and pre-op inspections were applicable. Most Eagle auditors were already doing this. SQF saw this as a need to cover pre-op, as this is one of the most important functions in a food safety management system. They will focus on how you conduct pre-op inspection and also look at the equipment to ensure inspection is sufficient and things are not missed. I've done pre-op at all the plants I've audited since day one, because I think pre-op has been very, very important. And I've really stressed a lot of our auditors to do the same thing. And actually, at the SQF conference this week, I led a roundtable, and I asked the people at that roundtable how many people have done pre-op in their facilities, and the only ones that raised their hand were SQF companies that were audited by Eagle, which I felt pretty good about. So it's very important to do that. Watching the person doing the pre-op, making sure they're competent. If they're missing stuff, then those are going to be things you're going to write up as a nonconformance. If you look, and it's also a good opportunity to get a close-up look, visual inspection of the equipment. Is that equipment well maintained? Is it in good condition? Sometimes you can't see it when it's running, but when they're doing pre-op, the equipment probably isn't running. There's an option for corporate audits. And again, this is totally optional and may help with the confusion that sometimes exists with those elements that corporate is responsible for, such as R&D, purchasing, and maybe supplier approval. New mandatory elements for complaint management, that's required for all scopes. Allergen management, which we'll go into a lot of detail today, is mandatory, which for Eagle we put in place several years ago as we saw a need due to issues of allergen-containing soaps and chemicals in egg processing plants and packaging manufacturing plants. So my auditors, the Eagle auditors, identified this, and we saw that as a trend. So 2 years ago at our boot camp, we said this was mandatory. So I felt pretty good about that since SQF has now made it mandatory. Major closeout time for corrective actions has been changed. Basically for the major is going to be allowed to be closed out in 30 days, which makes a lot of sense. You know, they have to put a correction in place for that major, but majors, you want to make sure you do a good corrective action, and with all the emphasis on corrective action and good root cause analysis right now, it really wasn't fair to the sites to have something in place within 14 days. So that was moved back to 30 days. And then removing opportunity for improvements as a response. OIPs will not be issued in 2018. This is also true for other food safety standards as well, as FSSC has also done this. The concern here was soft grading, and that's been a big emphasis by SQF. Seeing scores that are 100% scores, they're concerned about that. Are the auditors digging deep enough? Are we issuing OIPs where we should be issuing minors? And when I say we, I'm talking about all auditors, not just Eagle auditors, but auditors who ever audit SQF. So it's going to be a strong emphasis to us to eliminate soft grading, and this is their way of doing it through their standard. The unannounced protocol remains the same. However, they have added a voluntary annual unannounced audit and how that's recognized. So companies can do this. We, as a company, as a CB, would love to see everybody do unannounced audits because it's easier to schedule. But one nice thing about this, if your company decides to do this, the company will be recognized on the cert. It'll say unannounced, voluntary unannounced audit program or something to that effect. And actually, when you look back at what we've looked at and SQF has looked at overall the entire system, the scores, there's not been a huge difference between unannounced and announced. The surveillance audit following suspensions is now termed as an on-site visit and unannounced, so it definitely will require an on-site visit. Withdrawal sites are posted on SQFI.com for 12 months. Withdrawn sites are required to wait 12 months before reapplying for certification. New section on compliance, and basically this is in 5.4 Part A. It basically states that you may have a witness auditor at your site and it has to be allowed. And this is specifically written to the sites that are being audited. SQF, CBs, and their oversight bodies have to witness auditors to ensure consistency and calibration of those auditors. Many companies forget this. Part A is a document that they have to comply with. But it is important because this is a very important part of the whole third-party certification process. I know a lot of clients have concerns that you're going to bring another auditor on base on site, and that auditor is going to cause the audit to change, and he's going to add nonconformances to the audit, or the auditor is going to feel like I'm going to have to get really hard because someone's watching me. Well, we try very hard, and the auditors have been witnessed. You guys know when we go out and witness audit, we try very hard not to put extra pressure on you. We also try to, if we see something that you don't document or you don't see, we communicate that to the client after the audit is over with, unless it is a major issue. And our oversight body does the same thing. So this now is a requirement that our sites have to allow us to have witness auditors. Technical experts, if they're used, have to be on site during the audit. And then there are several changes in the food sector code, which are in the next slide, which we're not going to talk about a whole lot, but just want to make you aware of that. So they've added on the right-hand side of the column, they've talked about the different things they've added or that they've removed in that process. So we're going to look at key elements in the code itself. Change to site rather than organization, supplier, or facility. So hopefully during this presentation and this training session, I refer to the facilities that we're going to go in and audit as sites. And again, after doing this for so many years and calling them facilities or suppliers, I might get confused, but it should be referred to as sites now. So there's going to be a huge emphasis on senior management. There's a new element on change management. They've emphasized site management responsibility for training and communication. It now requires a monthly meeting between senior management and the SQF practitioner. And then blackout periods now included in system elements to allow auditor opportunity to check designated blackout dates. And that's talking about the unannounced audit. So in 2.1.2.10, it talks about how do you ensure the integrity and continued operation of the food safety management system in the event of organization and personnel changes within the company or associated sites. And this is where that change management is coming into play. Many times I've seen the system totally fall apart when the SQF practitioner is left. So how is the company going to prevent this from happening? Again, might be strengthening that backup, putting more emphasis on that backup, but they have to prevent a breakdown of their system if that SQF practitioner leaves their site. So that's one of the things that the change management system wants to have in place. The auditor is going to look at maybe competency of the backup, maybe spend more time with the backups to have them answer questions, may look for a change management procedure, something like this, to see how they're complying to that change management process. And then in 2127, there's stronger language on staff informed of their food safety and regulatory responsibilities and aware of meeting the requirements of the SQF code. Used to just include reporting food safety issues, so they beefed up that section a little bit. The auditor is going to add questions to see if the employee understands their roles, maybe as it's related to regulatory requirements. And this is especially important for those plants that are under the new FSMA rule. 2132 talks about monthly SQF audits. And this is basically monthly SQF updates to senior management. It does not have to cover all the items in 2.1.3.1, but it needs to be documented with what was covered. Auditors are going to look for meeting notes and attendance sheets for these monthly meetings. Also notice that several requirements have been added to what is reviewed at the minimum annually. They've added hazard and risk management system and follow-up from previous management reviews. That's been added to the list of criteria that had to be covered in the management review on an annual basis. And it all makes sense to me. The goal here is to create action items to improve your system and then review to ensure that they are being addressed. And then 2.1.2.11 talks about blackout date requirement. Any blackout dates by the site must be submitted to the CB to the 60-day window for unannounced audits. It has to be business related, such as not running due to construction or some other reason. Cannot be for SQF practitioner being on vacation or any of your management team being on vacation. The auditor will be required to verify all blackout dates. So if you had blackout dates, there needs to be evidence why you were closed. If due to not running, then we're going to look for those records. We're going to make sure there were no production records during that time frame. So the auditor is going to do some investigation on your blackout dates. In 2.1.5, the business continuity planning now is called crisis management, and it has a few more detailed requirements in there. It's not a new requirement to test the system, but many companies have had issues with this. It needs to be more than a mock recall. You need to look at your threats, and the auditor is going to make sure that you're doing different tests on different years. Like if you have a threat for weather shutting down your plant, how did your test reflect that? It doesn't say you have to do every one of your threats every year or you have to do this threat this year, but you've got to do something more than a mock recall. So you got to look at the threats that you defined in your crisis management plan, and you need to test at least one of those threats every year. 2.2.1, document control. There's no changes in that, but it now makes reference to a food safety manual in that section. 2.4.3, there's significant changes around the food safety plan. New element to require regulatory controls as well as codex. In the past, it just said you had to meet codex requirements. Now it goes into a lot more detail. So that has to be all documented. And then, of course, there's a new element on food fraud, which we'll cover in a later slide, and some more requirements for food defects. Again, we'll cover that in a later slide. These are the HACCP requirements. These have to be documented to show evidence that the plant has done them. So many of these requirements were implied in Edition 7.2 as the plan had to comply with Codex and MAC, MCF. They were required to be followed. So the first one, a multidisciplinary team. It must include the SQF practitioner and those who have technical knowledge of the process and the product. It doesn't have to include everyone, but it should include quality, production, shipping, receiving, maintenance, sanitation, and other departments that may require or add expertise. If it is only a quality personnel, it will be a nonconformance. Scope needs developed and documented, including start and end points and inputs and outputs. Inputs to include process aids, raw materials, ingredients, steam, water, gases used in your packaging, packaging materials, etc. These have to be identified. Outputs may include byproducts. If you have any kind of feed items that's going into the animal feed or pet food industry, finished product rework. Rework needs to be in the process flow. Product descriptions need to be developed for all products. They may be grouped if they're very similar. Can reference product specifications but need to include other parameters if not in the specification. So like maybe water activity ratio or pH. If that's not defined in the specification, those are key parameters for many, many products that I audit. That needs to be defined in that product description. Intended use statement includes target consumer groups, potential consumption by risk population, and potential alternate use. So basically, you got to look at, do I have any target consumer groups that may be at-risk populations, like schools, hospital, nursing homes? You know, if they're going to be doing further processing requirements, if you're selling to another processor for their process, you need to understand that. And then a potential alternate use of an item really opens up a lot of things, because now you have to address that alternate use if you know that's going to happen. And for food, the one that comes to mind right away is cookie dough. A lot of people like to eat cookie dough, and cookie dough is designed to be cooked. But if you know your consumer is going to probably eat raw cookie dough, you need to have that built into your plan. Another one, which is more towards packaging, would be those nice little Tupperware containers that you get luncheon meat in. My family saves those containers. We put them in the dishwasher. We wash them. We reuse them time after time after time. You, as a supplier of manufacturing packaging, needs to make sure they're acceptable and safe, and that you're putting that risk in your HACCP plan. There's specific requirements for flow diagrams. Every step of the process and wherever inputs enter the process have to be defined. And these include process delays. So if you cook one day and then the product is chilled prior to final processing and packaging, this has to be defined. It needs to be confirmed by the food safety team. The auditor will be looking for verification that the food safety team has verified the flow diagram. The best practice is to sign and date the flow diagram. Notice the code says confirmed by food safety team. So expectations is the food safety team signs off on the diagrams, not just the SQF practitioner. The hazard assessment is the same. Make sure the hazard assessment is completed for raw materials, any inputs into that process. So it did add that. So you want to make sure that raw materials, processing aids, steam and water and gases, etc., are looked at in your hazard assessment. More HACCP requirements. Control measures need to identify and document for those hazards that are identified. Was present, and most people that I audited had those in place. CCP identification shall be documented. Again, most plants did that I went into the last couple of years. CCP has to have defined critical limits, again, which is nothing new. These critical limits have to be validated so the level of control needed is accomplished. Was previously in 2.5.1, but now is in the HACCP requirement section. Development and document procedures to monitor CCPs. This is a shall, so procedures need to be developed. The previous edition, 7.2, only made a statement that said applicable SOPs and work instructions are written to cover scope of certification. This is now a new shall. So expectations is for my auditors is to make sure that you have procedures written to describe how that CCP will be monitored. You might have that in your HACCP plan, but now it says you have to have a procedure to do that, which procedures are going to probably go into more detail. I see an example of that I see now that people do a good job of is they'll have metal detection defined as a CCP. So they'll have their frequency at once every hour. They're going to have the pieces that they're going to be checking through the metal detection. They're going to have who's doing that check. It's the operator or QC person. And they're going to have those defined out, the when, who, what, when, and how. Well, it might not be as in great detail because then they add more detail in the procedures that they have. Like maybe they're going to run each metal one through 3 times. And then if you have any issues, you're going to put the last product on hold from the last acceptable check and get maintenance to fix them out. So it has a lot more detail. So that's what the code is looking for. Deviation procedures shall be developed and documented. Corrective action is part of the HACCP plan, but expectations is to develop this to more detail than what you may have in your plan. Describe actions on how to correct and prevent recurrence. They have to review annually. Code acts required it, but was not written in the code as a requirement. The plan has to be reviewed by the food safety team each year at minimum. It also has to be reviewed whenever changes occur. Changes include any inputs, equipment, processors, or any other changes that may affect the plan and the product. These reviews need to be documented. One of the biggest issues I see currently as an auditor is sometimes I stumble on a change in equipment or a change in the process, but yet there is no evidence that the food safety team evaluated these changes when they happened or before they happened, preferably. The plan needs to be verified. Verification is generally 2 parts. Visually observing the monitoring activity to ensure it is done properly, and then record review. Most companies do record review on everything, so that's usually not a problem. But it's that visual observing, making sure that person's doing that check the way they're supposed to is sometimes missed by a company. And also, if they use an instrument used for CCP monitoring that needs calibrated, then that calibration is considered part of a verification activity. These should be documented in their HACCP summary plan, or whatever they have that spells out what their HACCP plan is. And then lastly, 2.4.3.17, regulatory requirements have to be met. Basically, this states that if the regulatory requirement includes something different than the HACCP plan, then those requirements will be met, including these requirements for HACCP, which I just reviewed. HACCP does not go away. But this is one of those element requirements for FSMA are added into the standard. So we're going to cover FSMA at the end of this review of modules 2 and 11. So if they have things missing, like they have allergens in their program and they didn't do a preventive control identifying the allergens, then that could be written, a nonconformance written against 2.4.3.17. So 2.4.8, environmental monitoring program moved to a different element. It is a risk-based plan, so a plan for a high-risk food such as ready-to-eat meats will look differently than a plan for shelled eggs. The pathogens or bacteria tested for in these type of situations will be different, and the frequency may be different. So facilities may use pathogen testing, they may use indicator organisms. But it says you have to have a plan in place based upon your risk. They also added in 2.4.8.4 specifically spell out the requirements to monitor and evaluate for trends. Corrective actions need to be implemented. This is just not as simple as re-clean and re-inspect. It needs to be more detailed if they notice that trends are being observed. So can a company risk assess their way out of the environmental monitoring program? It might be possible if the facility is such a low risk, but I would expect a pretty strong risk assessment that's going to spell that out and why they feel so, and has support that with scientific documents. 2.6.1-3, new element regarding product startups and changeovers. It says product startup and changeover procedures during packing are documented and implemented. This is to ensure correct product is in the correct package and current label. Changeover needs to be inspected and approved by an authorized person. Also addressed in allergen management requirements in more details for those products that have allergens in it. But this part of the element is for non-allergen containing products. allergen management has many more additions to the element, mainly due to the fact that most recalls nowadays are towards allergens. So 2.8.1 allergen management is split in several distinct elements, and we're going to go over them separately. And it's also added a lot of different things with 2.8.1.1, but we'll go over them on the next slide. So the allergen requirements. 2.8.1.1 Roman number 2 says an assessment of workplace-related food allergens from locker rooms, vending machines, lunchrooms, and visitors need to be performed. Expectations is that there needs to be some type of documented assessment that shows that the allergens that may be present in these areas are identified. So how is this handled, and any hazards that are identified mitigated? You know, removing smocks, washing hands may be a mitigation activity for those items identified, which most plants have in place now anyhow. If you don't remove your smock but you have regular clothes, you have something to brush off those clothes and then wash your hands. These are the type of things that the auditor is going to be looking for. We're going to have a management plan for control of identified allergens. That plan shall include identification, management, labeling, and now it includes gluten. So if they have gluten on their site, now this plan includes gluten. 2.8.1.4, again, stronger requirements for cleaning and sanitation. Element also includes the management of aerosols. Very important. If you're hitting high pressure water, that's going to create aerosols. How does that affect lines that might be close to you? So if you're cleaning a line that maybe runs peanut butter, you package fruit or vegetables, and you got a little dipping, and you got peanut butter. If you're using high pressure water, how does that aerosol affect the line that's next to it if it's a close line? So that's something that has to be reviewed and evaluated. 2.8.1.6, product changeover procedures shall be documented to eliminate cross-contamination. 2.8.1.8, documented procedures for finished product, label accuracy of finished product, and ensure work in process and finished product is true to its labeling. This may include label approvals at receipt, reconciliation at production, destruction of obsolete labels, changeover procedure to include verification of labels, and several other things. But this is a specific requirement now that has to be in place. 2.8.1.11, sites that do not handle allergens need to have these minimal requirements addressed, and it defines those minimal requirements. So if they have no allergen, or maybe it's a shelled egg facility and all they have is an egg allergen in their facility, and that's in all the allergens, they still have to have basic requirements of the code. Eagle has always looked at that as being employee training, including those foods that they bring into the facility and those foods that might be in the vending. Chemicals, did they have anything in their chemical control program that looks at allergens? So you have training and chemicals, and then again, washing hands and making sure they're following those GMP practices. So food fraud is another big new additional requirement to the code. Food fraud is a collective term used to encompass the deliberate and intentional substitution, addition, tampering, or misrepresentation of food, food ingredients, or food packaging, or false or misleading statements made about a product for economic gain. Food fraud and food defense are listed in both the manufacturing code and the quality code. Some food sector codes might not have a food safety risk for food fraud, but they might have several quality risks for food fraud. You know, the one that comes to mind might be shelled eggs. You know, there might be one or two shelled egg food safety risk, but when you go into quality, there could be a lot. If you manufacture organic eggs, or you manufacture cage-free or specialty eggs like that, well, you have to have a plan in place to make sure there's going to be no food fraud going on. So that's a big piece for the quality piece. So I think a lot of food sector codes might have minimal food safety issues for fraud, but will have a lot of food quality issues. In the SQF manufacturing code, 2.4.4.5, the site's food fraud vulnerability assessment shall include the site's susceptibility to raw materials or ingredient substitution, mislabeling, dilution, and counterfeiting, which may affect food safety. So you need to look at, it doesn't have a specific way in which that needs to be looked at or how it needs to be documented, but they have to do this. I'm going to talk about something later on in the slide of some key questions that we as auditors should ask if we don't see it well represented in their documentation, but something that our sites should be documenting and asking as they do the review of these ingredients and raw materials. And then it says if they identify things, they have to have a mitigation plan in place and how they're going to control these issues that they've identified. And we're going to talk about this in a later slide about food fraud. Food defense is now mandatory, which I think most plants I've gone into had it anyhow. 2711, the methods, responsibility, and criteria for preventing food adulteration caused by a deliberate act of sabotage or terrorist-like incidents shall be documented, implemented, and maintained. One of the things that I have seen in the plans is they do a great job of preventing people coming into their facility, but they do a poor job of sabotage. So that's something you probably need to look at a little closer as an auditor or as a facility, a site. You need to look at where is potential for sabotage in my operation. So the food defense plan shall include all these measures. So some of the changes occurred in Roman numeral 4. And what it says, the measures taken to ensure the secure receipt and storage of raw materials, packaging, equipment, and hazardous chemicals. It added more details to that requirement. The next one is Roman numeral 5. The measures implemented to ensure raw materials, ingredients, packaging, materials, work in process inputs, and finished products are held under secure storage and transportation conditions. Went into a lot more detail on what items have to be controlled and protected. But to me, the biggest change is Roman numeral 6. Review of your food defense plan. There must be a record of the plan being reviewed. Some plants already do this with the FDA food safety assessment or food defense assessment in their current system, but now it's a requirement in the code. You go to 2713, the food defense plan shall be reviewed and challenged at least annually. Expectations is a record of the review, so if you do the review, there's got to be a record of that review in addition to a record of the challenge. Some plants currently challenge their program by hiring an outside person to see how far he can get into their facility before one of their employees stop him. So that could be a potential challenge thing that you do. Will your employees stop that employee and then documenting that as an actual challenge study? No different than you would document your business continuity plan or maybe your mark recall exercise. Reviewing and challenged are two separate activities, so they need to be documented as two separate activities. This is all the food fraud, so I'm not going to read over each one of these elements. You guys can read. So to read over those elements, we're going to talk about food fraud. It's found in the quality code. We've already talked about that. It's also in the food safety code. They got to do the same thing in both codes. They got to identify food fraud. They got to do a food fraud vulnerability assessment. The assessment shall include the site's susceptibility to ingredient or product substitution, mislabeling, dilution, and counterfeiting that may adverse product quality. And then there must be a mitigation plan in place for those things that are identified. No different than the food safety, just added the word quality in there. So what is a food fraud vulnerability assessment? Well, the code does not specifically spell out what that needs to look at. Even at the SQF conference, they talked about there's a lot of flexibility here. You know, one way I think companies can do it is it might look exactly like a HACCP plan. You might look at your ingredients, go down the list and say, hey, what ingredients do I have issues with? What ingredients do I have concerns with? And there's some key questions I'm going to talk about that maybe as a site, you can ask yourself. Also, too, there might be something that the auditor can ask them to see if they really did a good job at their food fraud vulnerability assessment. The assessment must be documented, and the hazards must be identified. The assessment will determine if there are hazards and which ones need preventive controls. Examples of food fraud, it could be dilution, water. In the old days, I used to get combos of meat into my ground beef facility, and there'd be a lot of purge in the bottom of that. Well, someone was adding water to it to increase the weight. They might add 2% water and try to pass it off as excess as purge. Mislabeled or misrepresented. If you're stating that, your product is cage-free, but it really isn't, that's misrepresentation. It's mislabeling. It may be tampered with. It may be substituted with another product. So if something has a lot of price fluctuation, they might substitute it with something less expensive, and that would be considered food fraud or counterfeiting. I looked up what are some of the top products for food fraud. Olive oil, very expensive. Sometimes that may be exchanged out with hazelnut oil. Honey may be substituted or have corn syrup put into it or fructose. Orange juice may also have less expensive juices put into the formula. Seafood is a very common one where less expensive species may be substituted for a more expensive species. The problem here, though, is a big food safety issue because some of those less expensive species might have a toxin that isn't in that more expensive species. Horse meat in Europe was the big thing that got a lot of people looking at food fraud from a food safety issue. Melamine in milk and infant formula. In 2008, the Chinese milk scandal was a food safety incident in China. The scandal involved milk and infant formula along with other food materials and components being adulterated with melamine. China reported an estimated 300,000 victims in total. 6 infants died from kidney stones and other kidney damage, and an estimated 54,000 babies were hospitalized. The chemical gives the appearance of a higher protein content when added to the milk, which also led to a protein deficiency, and that's why that company added that product to their milk. They could get by with maybe a diluted milk, but the protein level would stay up because of melamine. So very, very, very important. The site needs to understand the base potential food fraud for their raw materials and their ingredients. Is their industry subjected to potential food fraud? Does this potential food fraud carry a food risk? And you need to identify that. So what is a food mitigation plan? It says a documented control plan to manage the food fraud hazards identified in your vulnerability assessment. Again, no different than your HACCP plan. You have a HACCP plan that identifies food safety issues, and you put a CCP or a control point in place to manage those hazards. Well, no different here, but you're identifying those food fraud hazards that might be a food safety issue, so you're going to identify those control measures to have in place. But the vulnerability assessment needs to be documented. Again, it may look like a HACCP plan, but it doesn't have to be. So where do you start? Well, you start with known threats. Has it been in the news? Has there been a regulatory warning on this? Is there extreme price fluctuations about the ingredient? These even could be columns. You could have your ingredients. I could see sites having ingredients on one side and raw materials and asking these key questions and then providing, answers like, no, this has not happened. It's not been in the news. No, it doesn't have price fluctuations. And then, again, providing, where do they get some of their data for research? The United States Pharmacopoeia, USP, maintains a database that collects historical records of food fraud. So that's out there for you as a site to go out there and evaluate, has there been any issues for this item? The mitigation plan, again, may be similar to the HACCP plan. Wherever you identify a food fraud hazard, you put a control measure in place. Under FSMA, Preventive Controls for Human Foods, facilities need to identify food safety hazards which may be introduced through adulteration for economic gain, which has potential to cause illness or injury. Michigan State University has a great website, and I've got it posted up here on the slide. www.foodfraud.msu.edu, where you can learn more about food fraud. And this gentleman did speak at the SQF conference. He was one of the main speakers on the first day of the conference. So they're a real good resource for sites and for auditors both. Other sources include PwC. They have a white paper addressing a vulnerability assessment, including a practical decision tree to help you get started in your food fraud vulnerability assessment. And then look at the FDA website. Has there been any recalls? Has there been any advisories? Has there been any outbreak information based upon food fraud issues? 11234. I feel that this probably was evaluated in Edition 7, but now it's specifically spelled out in Edition 8. Pipes carrying sanitary waste or waste over product lines or storage areas are designed and constructed to prevent contamination and are easy to clean. I know whenever I saw pipes over a line, that was always a question I asked. What does that line have? What does it carry? Is it water? Is it something else? So how do they manage that hazard and that potential risk? 11262, Roman numeral 2, inspection and QC areas, waste handling and removal. Again, I think auditors looked at that. It wasn't specifically spelled out. It had to have hand washing. It had to be well lit, but it didn't say anything about waste handling, but we all assumed that if they had waste piling up that they need to remove it. Now it's spelled out more clearly. On a side note, those things in Module 11 can have a risk assessment that can be completed for that element if they control it by a different method than what's stated in the code. So if a site has a different method to control a code element than what's defined in the code, then they have to do a risk assessment to do that. If they're going to exempt out of that area, again, a risk assessment should be completed and justified on why they don't have to meet that requirement in the code. Now, one thing I've seen plants not do is they need to review these risk assessments annually. You need to verify that those alternate controls are working, and you need to validate that the hazard that you wanted to control by that alternate control is actually effective. Pest control. 1127, change vermin to pest and flies to insects. 11272, basically external personnel access areas that added to protect against ingress of dust, vermin, and other pests. Again, I think auditors were already doing that. These are just some word changes. 11274, poison rodenticide bait rather than poison bait. 11212.1, changed integrated pest management to pest prevention. 11212.2, this is a new element regarding pest activity. It's a new element in some regards, because I think if any auditors would solve this during an audit, they would write it up. It specifically states that identified pest activity shall not present a risk of a contamination to food products, raw material, packaging. Again, I think if auditors came upon this, they would write it up and they would document it in another part of the pest control element. But now it's a specifically called out requirement. 11.2.12.3. Again, specific requirements, what to do and document if you identify product, raw material, packaging that is contaminated by pest activity. Records have to be kept of disposal, investigation, and resolution. Again, this is audited, but now the specific actions are defined. And I have written plans up because they had no records of disposal, no records of investigation, and no records of resolution. But now that's in black and white. So specifically written in the code because I think maybe some auditors weren't writing it up when they should have been. Again, I generally find that a site identified the problem, corrected the problem, fixed the problem, but didn't document what they did. Equipment cleaning and sanitation. 11.291, new element regarding specifications for equipment, utensils, and protective equipment. We could spend a whole session, actually there was a 2-hour session at SQF conference talking about purchasing new equipment, evaluating it for condition, evaluating for ease of cleanliness, evaluating on how it's going to be fitting into your process, into your facility, looking at all those things before before you actually purchase the equipment, making it a checklist or having something in place. Now it says you have to have specifications in place for those items. 11292, you have to meet any regulatory requirements. All other requirements in this section were covered under 7.2. 11298 says it cannot provide contamination. The intent, from my experience, is trash containers in some industries are not cleaned on a regular frequency. 11210.8, where temporary repairs are used, they shall be included in the cleaning program. A plan in place to address completion. Again, I think most auditors looked at this because if they saw temporary repairs, a question came up, and this is kind of a temporary repair that can be cleaned. So if they use a material as a temporary repair that is cleanable, there still has to be a finalized item put in place, but they could probably use that as long as there was a process to clean that, and it has to be written in their plan. 11210.9, the term pre-op inspection was added, which makes record keeping of this process as a shall. So basically there was confusion out there, so now they cleaned it out. So if maintenance goes in and does an activity on the line, they were supposed to do tool count reconciliation, they were supposed to clean the area, and someone was supposed to come by, inspect it, and then start the line back up again. Well, expectation was that they would have this documented. Now they've cleaned that, clarified more clearly that that has to be a documented activity. It's black and white now. And then 11.2.11.1 talks about software shall be validated. If you have software that's controlling a process or measuring a piece of a product or something like that, that needs to be validated. 11.2.13.8, chemicals now must be labeled according to regulatory requirements. Not sure I saw a big issue with this, but now it's clarified more clearly. 11.2.13.9, mixing of chemicals, they must be mixed to manufacturer's recommendations, stored in proper containers, which means they need to be labeled, and mixed concentrations are verified and recorded. Concentrations can be checked by dip strips, titration kits. Doesn't define how they have to test it. It just says they have to be tested. And then key one, I've written this up many times, that people don't follow recommended instructions, and either the parts per million for that chemical or that sanitizer in general was exceeding their limits or was under their limits. So you need to look at that to make sure that they're mixing it and following manufacturer's recommendations. Because if they're not meeting the parts per million, it's not being effective in killing the microorganisms that it's designed to kill. And if it's going over that and there's no rinse following it, then it could be a chemical hazard to that product. So now that's spelled out a little cleaner in the code. 11.2.13.4, new requirement for CIP systems. Basically, it says CIP parameters defined, documented, monitored, and recorded. Again, most of you are already doing this. CIP was a sanitation procedure, so we require sanitary procedures, but apparently it's been needed some clarification in the new code. Spray balls need to be maintained. Spray balls is a good place where they can get plugged. They can get plugged, especially if you have ingredients dealing with a lot of stuff that can plug up holes or fatty. If you're cooking taco meat, fat can sometimes get in those spray ball holes. And if those holes get plugged, that CIP system is not going to be as effective as what it should be. And the validated expectations, the results aren't going to be met. So they need to be looking at their spray balls on some type of frequency. They need to validate changes in their system. If they do any changes, those changes need to be validated. And then CIP personnel have to be trained. So that's going to be a training record. It's going to be documented and has to be spelled out. Personnel, 11.3.1.2, it's a new element regarding contamination caused by bodily fluids. Measures should be written. Reference to first aid facilities removed, which I'm glad because I never understood why it was there in the first place. 11.3.3.1, basically says a risk assessment to ensure clothing and hair policy protects materials, food, and food contact surface from unintentional microbe or physical contamination. So if uniforms and hairnets are not used, you must document in a risk assessment that there is no hazard to these items described in your equipment. But there has to be a risk assessment completed on this, whether you use them or you don't. 11355 says, this is a new element about visitors. They shall be trained or shall be escorted at all times in food processing, handling, and storage areas. I thought it was there anyhow in contract service providers. But now is a specific requirement. It says if you have visitors coming to your facility, they must be trained. And if they aren't trained, they have to have an escort at all times. And they have to be trained in your food safety and hygiene procedures before they enter the processing plant. 11391, toilets that added, included an area inside or nearby for storing protective clothing, outer garments, and other items while using the facilities. I had some questions. Does this include helmets and hairnets? Again, I would look at it from your facility. If you're a high-risk facility, absolutely it does. If you're a low-risk facility, maybe not. You have to look at that and you have to do an evaluation from that standpoint. And again, if you do a risk assessment, I would make sure you document that risk assessment. 11392, sanitary drainage added accordance to regulation. 11310.3, it says new element about outside eating areas. Keep these areas clean and free of waste and no pest activity, which I think was being audited against anyhow in Edition 7.2. Personnel, 11411, Roman numeral 7, hair restraints are used when product is exposed. Risk assessment if you don't require hairnets or use of ball caps. Or if you use ball caps, I mean. Only food processing plants that could justify no hairnets, to me, could be a shelled egg facility. And again, if there's a customer requirement, then they have to wear hairnets, because that's a customer requirement, and that's covered in other aspects of the code, even in the food safety part of the code, not necessarily the quality code. If it's defined by the customer, like Costco, then they have to have hairnets. Water and air quality. 11542, the new element. Water used in processing shall be tested and, if required, treated. The intent of this requirement is that many sites use city water test results, which the sample never entered the processing plant. This element requires a sample taken within the facility. Again, I ran into this a lot, and I wrote nonconformances against it anyhow with 7.2, but now it's spelled out a little clearer. And that's where the next line item we just read. 11552, compressed air now includes other gases. So it might be nitrogen, carbon dioxide, that type of thing. Replace microbiological purity with applicable food safety hazards. 11515, water stored on site, storage sufficient to prevent contamination. It should be in a clean and acceptable container. And 11514, Roman numeral 3, hoses or taps are designated to prevent backflow and back siphonage. Again, probably audited with 7.2, but now spelled out a little cleaner in Edition 8. Storage and handling, 11.6.1.1. New element requires a storage plan. So the storage plan has to be documented. So the auditor will expect to see a procedure documented on how raw materials, ingredients, packaging, equipment, and chemicals are stored hygienically. From my experience, the dirtiest place in the facility is usually the sanitation chemical storage area. So now there needs to be a plan in place for how this area is going to be maintained. 11616 talks about alternative storage. Requires records shall be available to validate alternative or temperature control measures for storage of raw materials, ingredients, packaging, equipment, chemicals, or finished product. A lot of facilities that did this, they already had risk assessments in place, but now it's just a little more specific on what has to be done. 11915, a new element on controlled disposal of trademark material. If you have printed containers and you're going to dispose of them, you got to have a procedure in place on how you're going to dispose of those printed materials. This ties into food fraud. If someone comes by and steals your cartons, like your shelled egg manufacturing facility, and they steal your cartons and packs your eggs in those, then that's misrepresentation, even though you have no control of it. So now you have to have control. You have to manage that. 11915, new element on controlled disposal of trademark materials. 11916, new element on waste for animal feed. If an edible waste is used for animal feed, it must be stored and handled so it does not pose a threat to the animal or further processing of the item. Produce scrap and edible eggs, snack food waste, you have to have a process in place. 11.10.14, lot must be adequately drained to prevent ponding of water. I think every one of the auditors that works for Eagle was looking at this anyhow. It's just spelled out a little clearer. So we're going to cover FSMA. That's all the changes in the code that I could identify. And if you have any questions, you can email me. We have an email address at the end of this presentation, and that includes my auditors or any of our clients that we have or sites that we audit if you have any questions. Next, we're going to look at FSMA, and we're just going to cover this real briefly. But regardless of the country location of the site being audited, the SQF audit includes clauses related to the site's compliance with their applicable regulatory requirements. In the U.S., this may include FSMA requirements depending on the products being produced. In Canada, it's the Canadian food safety laws will apply. So it's just not in the U.S. It could involve if they export to Canada, if they export to Australia. There's certain things that have to be in place. The shelled egg industry, if they export to Canada, they have to do environmental monitoring program. It's not real strong. It's only maybe 10 sites once every 6 months for salmonella, but they have to do that. That's a requirement. That's what this section, that's what the code states. The SQF does not specifically state FSMA because SQF is a global standard, but FSMA requirements will be audited during the audit. SQF code, these are all the different clauses that talk about regulatory requirements. 241 of the SQF code requires that plant meet regulatory requirements. Again, they must meet FSMA if they're a FSMA-related facility. If a plant is SQF certified, then they'll meet approximately 85% of the FSMA law. And on the SQF website, there is a comparison that they've completed a long time ago, showing where the standards either stronger or maybe where it's missing some things. So take a look at that so you understand where you're at. And auditors, we need to understand the difference. So when we go in there, we don't have a whole lot of extra time to go dive into FSMA. So we need to be able to understand what exactly are we looking at. One of the quick things is preventive control qualified individual. Do they have one identified? Is that person competent? If they have allergens or the ready-to-eat process or preventive controls in place for sanitation program, for allergen management program, that should be spelled out a little differently. It should have a different flavor to it than if it was just a regular HACCP plan. So those are some things that you can look at real quickly. FSMA is evaluated in the audit if the plan is currently required to be in compliance. If the site is not compliant or lacking a key requirement, a nonconformance will be issued in the SQF audit. If the plan does not currently need to comply with FSMA until a later date, then we make these observations and we'll kind of share them during the audit. We won't be writing them up as opportunities for improvement because that's been removed. So what areas should we evaluate as auditors? What areas do you have to make sure as sites do you have to have in place for the SQF audit to make sure you cover FSMA? Well, is a preventive controlled individual PCQI identified? Are they competent? They do not need to complete the official training, but even if they did, competency needs to be evaluated. Again, evaluate preventive control hazards. We talked about this already. HACCP is still required by the SQF code, but preventive controls will include process steps, which may be their CCPs, but it's also going to include some traditional prerequisite programs. So you need to evaluate these preventive controls. Some of the examples of preventive controls may include sanitation, allergen, environmental programs, supplier programs. If they have allergens in the facility, a PC, preventive control, shall be identified for allergens. Also, in their hazard analysis, did they identify radiological hazards? That should be defined out because that's a requirement of FDA. for FSMA. Food safety records must be reviewed in 7 days. So how does the plant document this review? Is the review done in 7 days? Who can do the review? Anyone who is trained, as long as the PCQI has oversight, is allowed to do the review. What type of records? Well, it's records related to monitoring, verification, validation, other preventive controls. Also may include supplier records, audits, COAs, letters of guarantee. Record retention is defined as 2 years minimum. Training required for employees in food hygiene and food safety. And again, if they're doing monitoring of preventive controls, they have to be trained in that also. If a site audits their suppliers, it must be a qualified auditor, and that's in the FSMA requirements. These are the major differences that the auditors are going to look at. So the next thing we want to cover, and we're going to make this really quick because we're going to be covering this in some other training sessions, but it's corrective action components. SQF and even all the food safety schemes are really looking at this very hard on how we respond to corrective actions. So these are parts of a corrective action response: containment, correction, root cause, corrective action plan, objective evidence. And our work instruction 214 contains a lot of these things in there. And then closing with extensions. So a containment or correction, it's immediate fix for nonconformity, not required as a part of SQF corrective action response. Root cause should provide a systematic reason for why the nonconformity occurred, and if addressed in a corrective action will prevent reoccurrence. Should not be a restatement of the nonconformity. The corrective action should address how the nonconformity will be corrected in the future. A systematic change may include correction, but should address the system as a whole and not just the immediate fix for a nonconformity issue. Objective evidence should show how the corrective action plan was implemented. May include training logs, updated policies, procedures, pictures, etc. Something to support what you've done. So an example, I'm not going to go into extensions just yet. So an example, I went to a facility. I wrote up hand washing as a nonconformance. They did not do a good job of hand washing. The client came back and says, I retrained all my employees. I rejected that because I knew in my interview the employees understood a proper hand washing. They said you had to sing happy birthday twice. They had to wash for 20 seconds. They understood that requirement, so I threw it back at them and said I reject it. So he came back with me a couple weeks later and says, well, we interviewed our employees. We did a 5-why process, and we identified that they didn't wash their hands properly because all of our employees went to break and came back from break at the same time, and we only had one hand washing sink. So what they did as a corrective action, they added 3 more sinks, and they went on staggered breaks. That was a good corrective action. Now, they might have had the containment in place before they was able to get the sinks built. They might have had to do something, maybe staggered breaks, but there should be some kind of containment too. Closing with extensions. This is maybe a corrective action that requires a capital investment or prolonged construction work. This may be closed with extensions because we have to close these out in 30 days. So what should be submitted for these type of corrective actions? Well, one, you're going to have an immediate fix. You've got to have a correction or something that's going to manage that hazard in the meantime until you get your construction completed. So you got to have an immediate fix that's implemented to mitigate the risk from the nonconformity until a permanent corrective action can be completed. So for the corrective action that's going to be long-term, a signed letter of management commitment to complete the full corrective action and a timeline in which it can be completed. Quotes, work orders can also be provided. These are good examples. So what's an example maybe of a correction? So I go into a facility, it was not a super high-risk project, but they had some bad floors. They had cracks in the floors, and they couldn't get them repaired for another 3 months because they were in their busy season. So what they came back to me, because the concern we have is water puddling in there and creating a harbor area for listeria and some other bacteria like that. So they came back and said they were going to clean these, dry these areas up several times during the day. They were going to squeegee or take a vacuum and clean the cracks up so the water didn't stay stagnant. They also was going to purchase quaternary ammonia crystals, so quat sanitizer crystals. That was their immediate fix to control the hazard of bacteria that would be growing in those cracks in the floor. And then at 3 months, they provided me a letter, and then later on they provided me pictures of the floor being fixed. So that's an example of what we're talking about. If you have any questions, this is my email address and Ann Cooper's email address. So if you have any questions about the presentation, about the training session, feel free to email me. Thank you for your time, and good luck, sites, in preparing for Edition 8, and auditors. Good luck for understanding Edition 8 so you can go out and audit. Have a great day. Thank you.